What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we are going through the wide receiver starts and sits, and yes, we're going through all 16 matchups here as we head into week 3 of the NFL season. This is about the time where we're starting to get an idea of who these teams are, what their identities are, and yes, we will still continue to be surprised, but at least we have somewhat of a sample we didn't have before on how these teams are performing against different units in the NFL. I am recording this video after the Thursday night game, so there is some information that I just did not have available to me at the time of recording. But if you guys want to stay the most up to date, you want to know who exactly to start over the next player, you guys have to be using the rankings available on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link is in the description box below for that. But let's jump right into it. And the first matchup is Green Bay Packers versus the Denver Broncos. It's a decent matchup. Green Bay has not been super stingy when it comes to passing yardage. They allowed a really solid performance from Allen Robinson in week 1, and in week 2 Adam Thielen had a decent performance, as well as Stephon Diggs was able to find pay dirt. So for Emmanuel Sanders, it does look that there is some upside, but it could very well be a trap game. I partly say that because Vegas has this game as one of the lowest point totals of the entire week, second lowest to be exact, lowest being Chicago versus Washington on Monday. So not a ton of points to go around, at least by Vegas's prediction, and Green Bay is also favored by 7.5. We have him ranked as wide receiver 35. Courtland Sutton, he's ranked as wide receiver 47. And for Green Bay, the Denver defense may seem scary, but so didn't the Minnesota Vikings defense. Davante Adams was able to put up over 100 receiving yards, and this is the same team that allowed Tyrell Williams to go completely ham on them just 2 weeks ago. So Davante Adams, if you have him, fire him up. We have Adams ranked as the wide receiver 3 this week. As for Allison and Marquez Valdes-Scantling, neither of them made it into flex consideration. They're both outside wide receiver 3 territory. MVS is ranked ahead of Geronimo Allison, as it only takes really one play for him to pay off his start, but in which case, hopefully you're not in that much trouble to where you have to start either of them. The next matchup we have is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Detroit Lions, and this should be one where the Lions should succeed through the air. I know their mentality overall is to run the football as much as possible, but with the weak secondary of the Philadelphia Eagles, they should be able to exploit this matchup very well using Golladay and Jones. Jones is one of the higher upside flex players that you could put in. We just know that his target market share right now has been so low that it's basically a risky play no matter what the matchup is. As for Golladay, his targets have continued to pour in. He's now scored in back-to-back weeks and can safely be started as a high upside wide receiver 2, and in this matchup, emphasis on the high upside. For Philadelphia, all pass catchers have officially died. Deshaun Jackson, Alshon Jeffrey, they are eyeing a week 5 return in a perfect world. That leaves Mac Hollins, Zach Ertz, Nelson Aguilar, and not a ton else. So expect the most production to be gained coming from Zach Ertz at the tight end position. As for the wide receivers, Aguilar could be an interesting start. We didn't bump him up too high just because we suspect that this team can be creative, especially through receptions out of the backfield. So for Philadelphia receivers, it's really hard for us to recommend starting any of them. Jones, start him as no more than a high upside flex, and Golladay, we have him ranked as a high-end wide receiver too. Moving on to the next matchup though, Baltimore Ravens versus the Kansas City Chiefs, in another matchup that has the highest overall projection of the entire week, and that may be a trend for any team facing the Kansas City Chiefs. What does that mean? You can start the players you wouldn't normally start, that being the Marquise Browns, the Mecole Hardmans. Those are all in flex consideration. We do have Marquise Brown slotted in as an actual wide receiver 3 and a mid-grade 1 to put it at that. Mark Andrews, obviously an auto start, and Sammy Watkins, we are expecting a bounce back performance from him this week. I know it's against Baltimore, but Baltimore's defense has not looked as scary as it has in the past couple of seasons, at least not up to this point. So wide receiver 12 ranking for a home game for Watkins does not seem too egregious, especially in a game with one of the highest over-unders of the entire week. But the only people you're realistically starting, Kelsey, Watkins, potentially Hardman, Marquise Brown, and Mark Andrews. Buffalo Bills versus the Cincinnati Bengals. And at this point, you have to start John Brown every week. No, we don't have him ranked ridiculously high. He's still a high-end wide receiver 3, low-end wide receiver 2. But that's because there's just so many good options this week. Boyd actually coming in behind him at wide receiver 29, still making it in as a wide receiver 3. But these are two offenses that you really just don't know 100% what to expect from. So trusting any of these guys as anything higher than that is a little bit risky. John Brown has shown enough from the targets to the performance to actually be trusted. Tyler Boyd is a little shaky. John Ross, on the other hand, he can still be started. We have him as a high-end wide receiver 4, but we've seen the type of upside that he can bring to the table. So starting him at your flex position, you could obviously do worse. But it's a simple game. Not much more is needed to be said other than that. We move over to an interesting game, the Indianapolis Colts versus the Atlanta Falcons, and I think some of you may be surprised that the Indianapolis Colts are actually coming in as the favorite. T.Y. Hilton, expect him to have a solid game. He's going to be locked and loaded as a wide receiver 2 for probably the remainder of the season with Jacoby Brissett. He's wide receiver 13 this week. You don't need me to remind you about his volatility though. The bad week is definitely incoming. As for the Falcons, we saw Calvin Ridley have a good game, Julio Jones have a great game. I wouldn't get too excited though this week. While we still do have Julio Jones ranked as the wide receiver 1 and Calvin Ridley as a back-end wide receiver 2, this secondary is a bit underrated and is less exploitable than the Philadelphia Eagles. Indianapolis currently ranks 10th in passing yardage allowed. Granted, they did play Tennessee, but with that said, you're not starting anyone else on the Colts, and you're definitely not starting anybody else on the Atlanta Falcons. Raiders versus Vikings. The Raiders last week did a very good job at taking Sammy Watkins out of the game. It's going to be difficult to predict exactly which wide receiver they intend to do that to in this matchup. Likely Adam Thielen, considering he's the volume guy. We still have both Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen ranked as mid-grade wide receiver 2s, 16 and 17 alike, with Stephon Diggs with the slight edge. Tyrell Williams did not get as friendly of a ranking. He's dropped to a back-end wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 4 because Minnesota, while they did get exploited by Devontae Adams for over 100 yards, that's Devontae Adams, there's still a very good passing defense, and that's not going to change. Derek Carr has been playing well, but not well enough to be able to pick apart this secondary like he has been able to do with some of the other subpar defenses. Don't be fearful of starting Darren Waller, though. That's a completely different situation. We have him ranked as tight end 6. Patriots versus Dolphins, and to start, may as well talk about the news. Antonio Brown released from the Patriots, and it's a little bit surprising, I'd say, because I thought they'd ride it out so long as there weren't any breaking developments in the case. Well, he's off the team now. That's good news for Julian Edelman and Josh Gordon alike, who have now jumped up the rankings. They were both back-end wide receiver 3s before. Now they're high-end wide receiver 3s at wide receiver 25 and 26, essentially back-end wide receiver 2s. Obviously, there's upside with them, but it could be a blowout and they could get up early, thus using players they wouldn't typically use in games that were more competitive. As for Antonio Brown, I'm not sure where his next landing spot will be or what the next development will be in this case. If the Patriots release you, that's not a really good warning sign for the likelihood of other teams being interested in you. Typically, teams like to follow suit after the Patriots, and if they're willing to accept Josh Gordon time after time and release Antonio Brown, that's really making a statement there. For the Jets, you can't start Robbie Anderson versus Stephon Gilmore, and Jamison Crowder, his fantasy value is still up in the air. It should be a positive game script for the passing attack of the New York Jets, but how successful they'll be versus this Patriots defense who has just completely demolished teams on defense, you can't in all good faith start anyone on the Jets wide receiver core. Believe it or not, this next game has an even higher point spread. Miami Dolphins being 23-point underdogs to the Dallas Cowboys. Amari Cooper, we have him ranked as wide receiver 6 and should have an absolute field day against this Miami defense secondary. Unfortunately, Michael Gallup's injured. He's projected to miss about 2 to 4 weeks, so look for Devin Smith to actually be taking the second highest target market share outside of Witten, at least on the outside. A lot of those targets could go to Randall Cobb, who could be in for a big game as well, but you really can't start in confidence either of those guys. Jason Witten at the tight end position, I could see him deserving a start, but we still have them all ranked outside of starter territory, including Witten himself not being ranked inside the top 12. And most of that stems down to just how big of a performance Ezekiel Elliott is projected to have. Heading over to a game I would recommend everybody try to watch this weekend. It's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the New York Giants, and we're going to see the first start by Daniel Jones, who looked really good in preseason and honestly can't be that significant of a downgrade from Eli Manning. I know Eli Manning's been doing or performing just as well as he had been the past 2 seasons, but regardless, the team decided to bench him in favor of Daniel Jones, which opens up a lot of questions on target distribution on offense and how smoothly this offense will move in general. Sterling Shepard, he's definitely deserving of a start regardless. Evan Engram in a thin tight end landscape is always deserving of a start, and a confident one at that, just due to the lack of weapons they have in general. They're 6-point dogs to a Tampa Bay team that's really not as strong as meets the eye. Regardless, you'd still be doing yourself a disservice by starting Sterling Shepard as anything more than a flex. But on the other side of the ball, the Tampa Bay side, Godwin and Evans, they're primed for a big performance. In fact, we have both of them ranked as wide receiver ones. Godwin is actually getting the edge over Evans for the first time in our rankings, and we'll see if this continues. Godwin has always been more efficient on a per target basis, and as long as the targets remain similar between the two, Godwin's going to outperform him. And to be frank, Mike Evans still has not looked like the Mike Evans we saw last season, but we know he was dealing with some issues and some illnesses as well, so we'll see if he bounces back. Right now we have him ranked as wide receiver 8, Godwin is wide receiver 7, so that just goes to show you exactly how well we believe that they're going to perform this week. Up next is the Arizona Cardinals versus the Carolina Panthers, and it appears that Cam Newton's not going to be playing, and that's a good thing for anyone who owns Cam Newton that didn't drop him yet. It's also a good sign for the pass catchers. I think Curtis Samuel and DJ Moore could still both perform better with the backup, just because Cam Newton looks so terrible. The last time we saw him on Thursday Night Football, he definitely needs to rest his injuries. Arizona Cardinals are actually favored in this game, which has a very low over-under. I don't believe that the Carolina Panthers defense is as bad as it let on in the Thursday night game. An offense that can't sustain drives does hurt the defense, so hopefully that can improve that area as well. Larry Fitzgerald, Christian Kirk, both back-end wide receiver 2s, high-end wide receiver 3s, ranked back-to-back in our rankings. But Curtis Samuel and DJ Moore do get the edge in this competition. We have DJ Moore ranked 22nd, Curtis Samuel ranked 24th, and Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald is 25 and 26. It's going to be an interesting game to watch, to say the least. The backup is projected to be Kyle Allen over Greer, and I believe that's just strictly due to his familiarity in the offense. But at this point, anything's going to be an upgrade over what Cam Newton was, or what we saw of him on Thursday Night Football. From injured quarterback to injured quarterback, we have the New Orleans Saints versus the Seattle Seahawks. Teddy Bridgewater taking the helm for the New Orleans Saints. The Seattle Seahawks, unfortunately, are not the best team or best matchup you would actually want to have in his first actual start. Vegas does agree, have him as 4.5-point dogs, but that still doesn't mean Michael Thomas should not be ranked as a wide receiver 1. We have him as a mid to back end wide receiver 1 at wide receiver 9. It is going to be a good opportunity for the second, third string wide receivers to get some more action. We do know that the backup quarterbacks tend to target the guys that they're more used to, which aren't always the wide receiver 1 in most cases. So we could see an uptick for Traquan Smith or some of the lesser known New Orleans Saints pass catchers. Either way though, you're not starting any of them. That's just more something to monitor. And for Seattle, Tyler Lockett, he's ranked at wide receiver 21, and DK Metcalf, he's a back end wide receiver 3, high end wide receiver 4, so putting him in at the flex may not be the move that wins you the week, but it's not the worst decision in the world either. Houston Texans versus the LA Chargers, and this is a matchup that me personally, I'm very interested to see. These are two teams right on the cusp of being playoff contenders that could make a push. LA Chargers, as usual, have a lot of hurt players on offense, but Mike Williams, he's getting healthier. Hunter Henry, they've been without, and their defense is starting to trend in the right direction. I think this is a very good spot for them against a Houston Texans team that is also underperforming as well. I think Mike Williams has a really good shot at reaching the end zone this week. He's been practicing, and that's not to take anything away from Keenan Allen. Comparatively speaking, we have Keenan Allen ranked as wide receiver 5, and believe it or not, the experts have him ranked even higher. And Mike Williams, we have him ranked as wide receiver 32. Before the Texans though, receivers not named DeAndre Hopkins may have a little bit of difficulty. The Chargers passing defense is solid as usual. Fuller, Cootie, expecting big performances from them while possible in a game that does have a potential to run up the scoreboard. It's just not the best matchup. Fuller we have ranked as wide receiver 33, Kiki Cootie wide receiver 58, and DeAndre Hopkins wide receiver 2. Moving on, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the San Francisco 49ers, and this is a game that's going to come a lot down to coaching. You have two of the best coaching staffs in the NFL. Pittsburgh Steelers are going to be without Ben Roethlisberger. He just had season-ending elbow surgery, which leaves Mason Rudolph. And a lot of people are very afraid to start Juju Smith-Schuster. Most of them are trading him away, but you're really only going to get pennies on the dollar. And Juju still likely will perform at or around where he's been performing for fantasy. It's not guaranteed, but what is guaranteed is an uptick in production for James Washington. If preseason's any indication, James Washington and Mason Rudolph, they have a solid connection. And I'm not saying to start him this week. It's just something to keep in mind and monitor. His stock's rising for me. Juju Smith-Schuster we have ranked as wide receiver 10. James Washington, for reference, is ranked as wide receiver 54. And Dante Moncrief, don't even get me started. We have him ranked at wide receiver 85. The coaching staff has came out and criticized his play, and we know what happens when the coaching staff of the Pittsburgh Steelers comes out and criticizes your play. It's usually a telltale sign that nothing good is coming from here unless he really picks it up, which is highly doubtful. Deebo Samuel, Marquise Goodwin, both ranked outside the top 50. Deebo Samuel is the most likely out of the three to have the highest production on the team, but how high will that production realistically be? Probably not too high. And then Dante Pettis, obviously, at this point, he's borderline droppable. I can understand not wanting to drop him since he hasn't been fully healthy, but a major disappointment to say the least. Moving on, we have the Rams versus the Browns, and you don't need me to tell you, Odell Beckham, he shook all the rust off. We have him ranked as wide receiver 4 in this great matchup that has the potential to run up the scoreboard. And if that scoreboard gets ran up, Jarvis Landry has an opportunity to perform as well, that being of a volume guy. There's no Njoku anymore. Not that Njoku is taking up a large target market share, but any targets that open themselves up in the middle of the field adds to more opportunity for Jarvis Landry, who we have ranked as wide receiver 36. For the Rams, it was easy to see last week Brandon Cooks was going to have a good game. His targets, not great. We do have him ranked as the lowest of the three Rams receivers. Cooper Kupp looked the best. His breakaway touchdown or almost touchdown, he looks like a force out there, and it really does go a long way in us being able to realize that he's healthy at this point. The Rams take the training wheels off, which it looks like they're doing. Cooper Kupp is a viable option week in, week out as a high-end to low-end wide receiver 2, and this week he's the high-end wide receiver 2 and ranked the highest out of the three receivers, Kupp, Woods, and Cooks. Kupp we have ranked wide receiver 14, Woods wide receiver 18, and Cooks wide receiver 19. Final matchup we have is the Chicago Bears versus the Washington Redskins on Monday Night Football, which I already mentioned earlier in the video is the lowest over-under of the entire week. Combination of Chicago's inconsistency on the offensive side of the ball, coupled with the overwhelming feeling of Washington overperforming on offense. We have Terry McLaurin, who sounds more like somebody running for Senate alongside Paul Perkins than that of a wide receiver 1, but he's been performing like a wide receiver 1. And in fact, his targets may not be the highest in the NFL, but he's been performing at an extremely high rate. And even against the Chicago Bears defense, he is deserving of a start. No more than a flex though. We can't get too overhyped over 2 weeks of production. Needless to say, Trey Quinn is left on the bench, ranked outside of the top 60. No other Washington receiver is worth mentioning past that, but we do have Allen Robinson on the other side of the football. We currently have him ranked as wide receiver 20, and we suspect he's going to be in line for a good game this weekend. Amari Cooper, he performed extremely well. We saw Alshon Jeffrey be able to reach the end zone against this defense at the wide receiver 1 position, so Allen Robinson should have no trouble so long as the target market share is there. Anthony Miller has showed us nothing to be afraid of when it comes to that. Taylor Gabriel is the only other true competition, so as long as Trubisky can put the ball in his hands, he's going to have a good game, and for that, we rank him as wide receiver 20. The aforementioned Anthony Miller ranked as wide receiver 65, Taylor Gabriel outside the top 80. But guys, that's going to do it for this week's video. Wide receiver starts and sits. In the comment section, let us know your toughest start and sit decisions, and if you are unsure between two players, go ahead and check out the website, the rankings, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link is always in the description box below. If you did like this video though, please make sure to hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.